UK, as NATO's main power, has taken some concrete actions against Russian invasion on Ukraine. In some occasion, Prime Minister Boris Johnson often condemns Putin's decision on Ukraine.
Yes, Metro Globe Network's Sam Krishna discussed the UK perspective on current situation in Ukraine with UK Ambassador to Indonesia, Owen Jenkins.
1 month has passed and Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues. Russia has not stopped, but neither has Ukraine's defenses. Its Western allies, including the United Kingdom, remain united in pushing back against Russia as well. To talk more, I am joined by the British Ambassador to Indonesia, His Excellency Ambassador Owen Jenkins. Hi, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Good morning. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. So as we know, the EU, G7, and NATO are holding emergency summits in Brussels right now. Can you tell us about the latest steps that Western allies and the UK in particular will take in helping Ukraine now and also to push Russia back even further?
Sure. But just as I start, I'd note that it's not just the West. This is an international struggle. And I think it was really striking that just last night in the United Nations General Assembly, 140 countries voted in favor of a resolution on the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Ukraine, with only 5 countries, basically Russia and its cronies, voting against. So the UK and its allies in Europe are working hard on this, but this isn't a fight between the West and Russia, it's a fight between Russia and international law and the international system. But with that said, you're quite right. The UK and its partners and allies in Europe and elsewhere are working hard on this. The UK is one of the biggest defence powers in Europe, the largest European defence spender in NATO. And we're standing up for those responsibilities with Ukraine. And we're doing that in a number of ways. We're providing assistance on the humanitarian side, which is sorely needed, with 12 million Ukrainians displaced within their country and 3.5 million having had to flee their country. The British people have been very generous on this, and there's £200 million plus of humanitarian assistance flowing from them. From the British government, there's over £394 million in humanitarian assistance flowing. And we're also providing military assistance, as you know, and just yesterday we announced that we would be providing the Ukrainian armed forces with 6,000 more missiles to support their heroic struggle against this illegal and unprovoked Russian invasion and breach of humanitarian law. So briefly, we and our allies and partners around the world are standing up for the principles which matter to us, and will continue to do so.
So, Mr. Ambassador, of course, the UK and NATO allies have repeatedly said they're not willing to close the skies in Ukraine. But now that Russia is using hypersonic missiles, which are extremely difficult to shoot down, how can the UK help Ukraine defend itself from such air attacks, which, as I mentioned, is very difficult to shoot down?
Yes, so you're quite right. We have said that we won't enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and that's because that would bring NATO forces into direct conflict with Russian forces. And I think the risks of escalation there, not just for NATO and Russia, but for Ukraine and indeed for the whole world, I think, are extremely high, and we don't want to run those risks. A no-fly zone would also prevent Ukrainian jets from flying, so preventing them from defending themselves against this unprovoked Russian attack. But even without that, there's a lot we can do to support the Ukrainians. And I'd note that the Ukrainian armed forces are performing heroically in resisting this unprovoked and brutal attack. And we want to help them. And as I've said, the UK is leading that effort. In the past, we've trained over 20,000 members of the Ukrainian armed forces. We're continuing to supply military support to Ukraine, including the announcement, which I mentioned, of 6,000 new missiles for them, including very advanced surface-to-air missiles, which we hope will help them in their effort to take down Russian attacks from the skies.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, I also want to talk to you about something that UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said. He's warned against a post-war reset, saying it would be a mistake to normalize ties with Vladimir Putin even after the war ends. So with that being said, how far is the UK willing to go? Is the UK seeking to cut financial and economic ties with Russia even after the war ends, so they have more leverage over Putin if something like this happens again, Mr. Ambassador?
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is let's see. I mean, it's up to Putin when this war ends and how it ends. Putin decided to invade Ukraine, invade a sovereign, independent country, and he did so of his own volition. He could stop that tomorrow. He could stop shelling civilian areas. He could stop his forces attacking hospitals and mosques and shelling cities like Mariupol. This is in Putin's hands, unfortunately. And I think that that sort of dictatorial leader, I think, is very dangerous. I think what Prime Minister Johnson was pointing to was the risks which have become very clear through this invasion of being dependent on an autocratic regime like Russia's, which has no respect for international law and international norms of behavior. And I think not only the UK, but other countries in Europe and wider have seen those risks of dependency. And that's why we are moving away from the use of Russian oil and gas, for example, and why we have made it much more difficult for Russian individuals and companies to do business in the UK. And I think he's absolutely right that we won't be returning to 2021 when this war is over. I think the risks which are inherent in being dependent on such a brutal regime are very high. And I think it's a brutal regime, not just for Ukraine, but it's for its own people. And I think we've seen the measures that Putin is prepared to take to repress dissent and to repress the protests against his illegal war. So I think there are lots of good reasons for not going back to business as usual.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, as you said, a lot of reasons not to go back to business as usual. Now I want to talk to you about Russian oligarchs as well. I know the UK have been placing sanctions on Russian oligarchs who are in the UK. But is the UK willing to ban Russian oligarchs from doing business in the UK for a long term, forever, until Putin is no longer in power? For example, Chelsea's former owner, Mr. Roman Abramovich, has been sanctioned. Will he be prevented from doing business in the UK in the future?
Again, let's see how the war ends, and the quicker that Putin decides to end his invasion of Ukraine, the more quickly we can consider those sorts of questions. I think what I'd say is that we are determined for the long run that no activity in the UK, whether by oligarchs or in the Russian companies, will be able to support and fund Russia's war machine, which, as we've seen, has rolled into Ukraine, but previously had attacked Georgia, had been the machine which led to chemical weapons use in Syria, but also on the streets of the UK. So we will sustain those measures which prevent individuals and companies from funding the war machine for as long as is necessary.
For as long as it's necessary. Okay, Mr. Ambassador. Now, of course, a lot of heavy sanctions have been placed on Russia. It's definitely hurt Russia's economy and ability to do things financially or economically. As a result, Russian President Vladimir Putin has recently demanded that Russian exports of gas be paid in rubles. So is the UK prepared to do this? Is the UK prepared to pay for Russian gas and oil in rubles?
So the UK is not a big user of Russian oil and gas. We have our own reserves and we have our own ways of importing them. And frankly, I think this shows how desperate Putin is getting. I think he's been really surprised by the unity of the international community in standing up to his illegal invasion. He's been really surprised by the heroism and effectiveness of the Ukrainian forces. And he's reaching for anything he thinks he can do to try to reassert control. And he will fail. I don't think this will make any significant difference. I think the world, and particularly European consumers of Russian oil and gas, have made clear that they're moving away from that. And that demand is not going to come back, not just because Russia has proved itself to be an unreliable and aggressive supplier, But because of climate change, we are all moving away from oil and gas anyway. So I think the idea that Putin can pull these levers and somehow that will return control to him is wrong. He's failing. He's getting desperate. That doesn't mean he won't get more aggressive. And I fear for the people of Ukraine and indeed of Russia. But I think he's on the wrong path.
Right. So can I just reconfirm, Mr. Ambassador? So the UK is not prepared to pay for Russian gas in rubles?
We've already said what we'll do in terms of Russian oil and gas, in terms of moving away from that. We're already diversifying our supplies.
Okay, got it. So regarding the UK's phasing off of Russian oil and gas, of course, there needs to be a search for alternative sources. Is there any sort of update on where the UK is seeking for alternative sources of oil and gas, Mr. Ambassador?
So the UK is lucky enough to have its own sources of oil and gas, and we've long been a leading producer through the North Sea fields, and that will continue. We also have long-term supply deals with reliable countries such as Norway and other countries further afield. And the other thing I'd say is that it's not just that we're looking to replace these; we're looking to move away from oil and gas entirely. The UK is one of the world's leaders in wind power, for example. We've almost completely phased out coal, and we're doing the same with oil and gas. So it's not, there is a short-term disruption for us here, but the move away from oil and gas is a long-term process.
Okay, so it seems like it has probably come at the right time to come off oil and gas completely, or moving towards that direction, Mr. Ambassador. Now, I have one final question for you, Mr. Ambassador. Now, in Indonesia, there are actually many Indonesians who sympathize with Russia and are against Ukraine and its Western allies or other allies and want Russia to defeat Ukraine. Do you have a message for them, especially seeing the destruction that has been suffered by Ukraine?
I do, and I think this is really important. And what I'd say is that this is not a fight between Russia and the West or Russia and the US. This is a fight between Russia and the international law and the international standards, which all of us rely on. Russia has taken a decision to invade a sovereign country, an independent country, and to violate its territorial integrity. That should be a threat to all of us. And I think it's important that we all stand up to that sort of aggression, that sort of imperialist mindset, which sees Ukraine as a vassal state, as a colony, which Russia should be able to dictate to. I think that mindset is not just a threat to the UK or our partners and allies, it's a threat to the whole world